In a small town, Del sneaks into a house and grabs all the batteries he can find. Before leaving, he tidies up and snaps a photo from a frame. Outside, he sprays paint on the street in front of the house. Other houses nearby also bear spray paint marks, showing he's been there. Later, Del heads to a library, sips coffee, and marks the house he visited on the town map. The next day, he breaks into another house and finds 2 dead bodies. He wraps them in a bedsheet, cleans up, takes another photo from a frame, loads the bodies into his truck, and drives to a field. There, he digs a hole and buries the bodies before going fishing in the lake. Afterward, Del returns to the library, has a meal, and settles in to watch an old movie on his laptop. That night, he wakes to a loud explosion and sees distant fireworks. The next morning, he hears a car alarm and discovers a gun in the back seat of the car. In the driver's seat, he finds an unconscious woman. Soon, she wakes up in a bedroom with Del standing there, a bandage on her head. She tries to leave, but the door is locked. When she calls out, Del asks if there's anyone else with her. She says no, and then Del questions why she's still alive. The woman throws the same question back at him. Del then asks about the gun she has, and she explains she bought it just in case the bodies came back to life. The woman pleads with Del to unlock the door, so he tells her to count backward from 100 before opening it. She agrees, but as soon as he unlocks it, she opens it without finishing the count. Outside, she wonders why she can't smell the corpses, and Del tells her he buried them. Del gives her the car keys, but she decides to stay. As Del leaves, she asks if he's not worried about the human race dying out. Del ignores her and wishes her luck. Later, she watches Del fishing, and then follows him back to the library, offering to help, clearing the dead bodies in town. Over a meal, the woman inquires about Del's thoughts on the sudden deaths around them. Del brushes it off, saying it doesn't concern him. When she asks if he ever felt lonely, Del replies that he did when everyone was still alive. Realizing Del prefers solitude, the woman decides to leave. But as she heads to the car, Del knocks on her window, asking where she's headed. She reveals she's off to Niagara Falls to see the landmarks. Curious why Del followed her, he admits he might reconsider having company, but worries she'll be gone by then. Del offers her a trial stay, to which she agrees, introducing herself as Grace. The next day, Grace settles into the same house Del brought her to after the accident. While driving around, Del spots Grace heading to the part of town he hasn't cleaned yet. When Grace prepares to remove a corpse from a house, Del insists on his specific cleaning method. Grace asks to be taught, so Del instructs her to gather batteries, the most vital resource the dead can offer. As he starts tidying the fridge, Grace wonders why bother since nobody's going to see it anyway. Del tries explaining entropy to her, saying he wants to minimize chaos. Grace understands it's about disorder, so Del clarifies his aim to reduce it as much as possible. Later, Del hunts for Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, mentioning Mrs. Young owes the library $700 in late fees. When Grace locates the book, Del is disappointed to find it damaged. While Del clears leaves outside, Grace notices an empty picture frame. As Del prepares to bury Mrs. Young's body, Grace asks if he'll say something, reminding him they're burying a human being. Del points out, Grace didn't say anything for every dead person she saw. But when she mentions holding her breath for 10 seconds upon seeing a body, Del agrees to say something before burying Mrs. Young. At the library, Grace goes to Del's room, but finds it empty. Spotting a family photo on his desk, she decides to peek in the drawer, discovering numerous pictures of past town residents. One day, Grace discovers a small dog in a house and brings it back to the library. Despite Del's allergy, he allows her to keep it, though he refuses to help name it. So Grace simply calls it Dog. During dinner, she mentions her goldfish that lived for 2 years, thinking it's a long time. But Del surprises her by saying goldfish can live up to 25 years, which Grace finds hard to believe. The next morning, Grace briefly checks the scar on her neck before meeting Del at the library. While Del rearranges books, she catches the dog chewing a magazine. Del offers to take the dog out so Grace can clean up, but the dog bites him. Later, Grace helps Del stitch up the bite. The following day, Grace wakes Del to tell him the dog is missing. He admits letting it out to urinate, upsetting Grace, but he promises to find it. Back at the library, Grace confronts Del with his collection of photos, pointing out he doesn't know any of the people in them and treats them like objects. Grace shares that her father passed away on the toilet and her mom died on the elliptical machine. Dell recoils slightly as she kneels beside him. She admits to being with a boy when others died, emphasizing she had people who cared for her while Dell was alone. Before leaving, Grace grabs the photos and tosses them at Dell. The next day, Dell takes Grace to a greenhouse, mentioning many houses still need clearing. He asks for her help but assures she's not obligated. While clearing more houses, they find CB radios. Grace, exploring on her bike, discovers a house missing from the map and calls Dell. Hearing her on the radio, Dell arrives, warning her not to be there. Grace realizes it's his house and offers to help clean it. Initially refusing, Dell eventually agrees, telling her to start cleaning. After burying the body, Dell and Grace share a moment of silence before covering the grave. In the car, Grace hesitates to tell Dell about her origins, but instead, she pauses and kisses him. The next day, Dell wakes up in Grace's room to the sound of a man laughing. He grabs Grace's gun and heads downstairs, finding a man and a woman with Grace in the dining room. The man introduces himself as Patrick, claiming Grace as his daughter, which confuses Dell. Patrick wonders why Grace never mentioned them to Dell and prompts her to explain. Grace admits Patrick and Violet are her parents, and Violet urges her to pack as Patrick needs to return to Palm Springs for a golf tournament. As Patrick discusses other survivors, he realizes Dell is unaware and scolds Grace for not informing him about the thousands of survivors and the signs they put up across the country to lead people to their commune. After Dell leaves, Grace follows and confesses that Patrick and Violet aren't her real parents. She was simply assigned to them when she arrived in California. Dell is upset Grace didn't tell him about the other survivors, and she explains she feared he wouldn't let her stay. Grace pleads with Dell to take her along, gripping the steering wheel to stop him from leaving. Dell forcibly removes her hand and drives off. As Grace starts packing, Violet implores her to return, insisting they can't manage alone and urging them to try to be a real family. Later, Patrick visits the library, asking Dell for audiobooks, but Dell ignores him. Patrick expresses admiration for Dell's intelligence and suggests they could use someone like him back in California, mentioning the commune's doctors who have made advancements in brain research. Dell shows no interest, so Patrick leaves his address on a book, in case Dell changes his mind. Dell shelves the book. As they depart for California, Grace watches tearfully from the window. Days later, Dell visits his old home and vents his frustration by throwing rocks. Back at the library, he turns on the CB radio, hoping to hear Grace's voice. One day, feeling overwhelmed by loneliness, Dell goes through his photo collection, recalling what he knows about the people in the images. Unable to bear the solitude any longer, he searches for the book with Patrick's address. Finally locating it, Dell sets off for California in his truck. On the journey, he encounters a bridge blocked by cars with lifeless occupants, prompting him to gather supplies and search for another vehicle. After some time, he changes his mind, but opts to switch vehicles upon finding a red convertible. Approaching his destination, he halts abruptly to gaze at the distant lights of the houses. Upon arriving at Patrick's residence, Dell observes Patrick and Violet through the glass door. Violet notices someone outside, prompting Dell to hide when she investigates. Finding nobody, Violet heads inside, mentioning she'll check on Grace. Patrick reminds her to adjust her loose head sensor. Returning to his car, Dell waits until Patrick and Violet drift off. When they extinguish the living room lights, Dell grabs his gun and infiltrates the house. Inside Grace's room, he finds her sleeping, connected to an ECG monitor. Noticing stitches on her neck as she turns, Dell rouses her, apologizing for allowing Patrick to take her. When Dell questions Patrick's actions toward Grace, Patrick reveals they're eliminating her negative emotions, believing it unfair for people to recall past traumas like anger and sadness. As Patrick continues, Grace abruptly shoots him. Violet emerges, displaying no grief at Patrick's death, revealing she once had a daughter. Before departing, she mentions they can use Windex under the sink to clean up. The next morning, Grace exits the house carrying her goldfish. Driving away, Dell observes the town's upbeat residents beginning their day. Grace apologizes for shooting Patrick, but withdraws it when Dell questions her sincerity. When she asks if it's okay not to feel remorse, Dell remains silent. As the convertible's roof retracts, Dell grins and cranks up the rock music on the stereo before driving off.
Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay connected with us.